All right, good morning, folks. Welcome to MEI's Defense Leadership Series. I'm Bilal Saab. I'm the moderator of the series. I also run the Defense and Security Program at MEI. And I teach at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. And just recently, I am now serving as an associate with the Klingendale Institute in The Hague. Today is episode 9. And we're looking to have it with a personal friend and someone with a lot of experience, both as a scholar and a practitioner. In defense issues, not just in the Middle East, but in many other regions around the world, and that's Derek Chollet. Derek, good to have you, man. Before I introduce Derek, let me just clarify what the Defense Leadership Series is all about, even though I'm going to sound like a broken record. We've done this several times now. So we created this program June of 2020, not too long ago. It's a speakers forum for current and former high-level military and defense leaders from the United States and the Middle East to discuss some of the more important policy issues facing the two sides. We inaugurated the series on June 10th with a conversation with the U.S. Marine Corps General and Commander of CENTCOM, Frank McKenzie. Let me introduce Derek briefly. He's the Executive Vice President and Senior Advisor for Security and Defense Policy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He's also a visiting fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House. Senior Fellow at the Kissinger Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Adjunct Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University's Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and in his free time as an advisor to Beacon Global Strategies. Is Andrew Shapiro still running it?
Yeah, he's one of the ones running it.
That's right. That's right. Dude, how do you manage all these things?
Keeps me out of trouble. Keeps me out of trouble.
That's right. 2012 to 2015, Derek was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Worked for two secretaries, that's Leon Panetta and Chuck Hagel. Before that, Derek served in the White House, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning on the NSC staff. He's held several other senior positions, both in government, but also in the think tank community. And that list you can find on his bio on our website or that of the German Marshall Fund. I will say that Derek has received numerous awards for his government service, and I'm sure he's proud of every single one of them. I'll say one more thing about Derek, which is that he's really a prolific writer of books. He's got a few, and the newest one is about to come out, and it's called The Middle Way: How Three Presidents Shaped America's Role in the World. It will be published in January 2021. By Oxford University Press. So just make sure you get a copy, which you can purchase through Amazon, and Derek, send me a free copy. My friend, good to have you. Thank you for doing this. How are the kids? Are they getting ready for Halloween?
Yeah, well, at first, Bilal, it's so great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation, engaging with you and also our listeners and the questions. And I really congratulate you on this series, which is I've watched a lot of the episodes, so really grateful to be here. We are in full preparation mode for Halloween. I've got little kids, and I think we were discussing earlier because of the remote schooling. I think they're even more excited about it this year than others. It's going to look a little different in terms of trick-or-treating. We're grouping up with our neighbors to do some alley trick-or-treating. And for those of you interested, our entire family will be dressed as Pokemon characters, including myself. I don't really understand Pokemon, but my kids love it. So to indulge them, my wife and I have got full-size Pokemon outfits. So we're going to hope to keep those pictures off the internet. But Saturday I will be full Pokemon.
Dude, you should see the neighborhood of ours. It looks like fierce competition. It's not even like quality stuff. It's just like how much stuff you can put out there so you can actually look better than your neighbor next door.
I have to confess, we have a few skeletons and gravestones in our front yard here. So
inflatable big things too.
Oh yeah, we're into it. We're into it.
There you go. Well, speaking of that, what's your favorite horror movie?
That's a good question. I'm gonna have to go old school and relatively new school. Old school, The Shining. Upon every viewing, it scares the crap out of me. But the most recent one that I've seen that I really enjoyed was Get Out, which came out a few years ago, which was terrific. Yeah. Highly recommended. And actually, a movie with a very important social message that's very relevant today here in the United States.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'll go with It, but the older one, Stephen King. To this day, I don't like clowns, obviously, but probably less disturbing, but still like one of the good ones. The Fly. Do you remember The Fly?
Oh yeah, of course, old school. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
yep.
yeah.
Yep.
All right. If I don't say this, I'll be in
Which, by the
trouble.
way, you know, there were some Fly memes that came back a few
yeah.
weeks ago with the VP debate and the Fly.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. That's right. That was the first thing that came to mind when I saw that.
Yeah.
I'll get in trouble if I don't mention this. Derek, a quick admin note before we begin. To submit, I'm just going to read this. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature. We're going to allow questions this time, which you can find at the bottom of your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. And feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking at all of your questions and we'll factor as many as possible into the discussion. Make sure to mention that. All right, ready?
Let's fire away.
Okay, well, first of all, since we mentioned the book, tell us about the book. Why did you write it? What's the bottom line?
Sure. Well, and thanks for giving it a bit of a preview. It's entitled The Middle Way, How Three Presidents Shaped America's Role in the World. And it focuses on three American presidents, Dwight D. Eisenhower, George H.W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And it's a leadership study about the way they looked at the world, the way that they approached strategy, the way that they approached crisis management, and the way that they each wrestled with the politics of foreign policy during their respective presidencies. And it makes an argument, and The Middle Way, the title actually comes from a phrase of Eisenhower's, and he talked about the middle way both before becoming president and then as president, as a way to think about politics and American leadership and its role in the world. And I make an argument in this book that when you step back and take a zoom out and look at these three presidencies and these individuals and how they looked at the world, how they looked at American power, how they looked at both the possibilities and the limits of American power, and the necessity of American leadership, that they had very, very similar perspectives, and that we in fact historically should look at them as a leadership cohort, and that often the similarities that they share are often partisan bias or historical amnesia, or frankly racism, that we don't see that how similar these presidents, who on the surface look very different. In fact, they are very different individuals. You know, Dwight Eisenhower, the last president born in the 19th century, you know, storied military career. George H.W. Bush, patrician from Connecticut, but became a professional age in Texas, you know, longtime public figure. Barack Obama, the first Black president, you know, growing up from outside the continental United States in Hawaii. You know, they're very different individuals. They travel different journeys, but nevertheless, they all shared a similar perspective. So it's not a book about the Middle East, but the Middle East is an important focus, particularly of the crisis moments in this book. And what I do is I trace three presidents and each how they handled several crises, and among them, it's Dwight Eisenhower in 1956 and Suez in Hungary, but particularly as George H.W. Bush, looking at March, April 1991 and the aftermath of the Gulf War, and the debate about what the United States should do after Saddam Hussein's forces have been kicked out of Kuwait, but the whole debate about going to Baghdad and giving support to the Kurds and the Shia. And then, of course, President Obama and his decision-making over Libya and Syria, and sort of tracing how these presidents wrestled with these decisions, also the broader political debate about these decisions at the time. And then I close the book reflecting a bit on what we can distill as leadership lessons from these presidents, and both in terms of how they acted in office, but then also larger questions for America's role in the world. So, you know, I hope the book will be relevant to people. I believe that with one outcome in November, maybe it'll be particularly relevant. If another outcome in November, maybe we'll have bigger problems than thinking about the historical legacy of Bush and Obama. But hopefully it will be interesting to viewers watching.
Well, congratulations on finishing it,
Thanks.
Derek.
Well, read it first.
Forward.
Read it first before you congratulate me. But that it may.
No,
Yeah.
look, I'm in the process of finishing one, so and you've
Yeah.
done several already, so I understand that even just getting out of the way, and
It's-
you know,
yeah. It feels
it's a
good.
process.
And I'm hoping it will kick off a debate. I mean, I'm quite sure there'll be folks on both sides of the political aisle here in the United States who will take issue with some of my arguments and the comparisons that I'm making, and I welcome that. That's something I'm looking forward to engaging in once the book is out.
Well, that's the whole point, exactly. All right, man. Let's get right into it. We've got a few here, and as I said, I do want to take a few from the audience. Let's talk about the Middle East overall in this era of great power competition. How do you just view the region now, of course, in light of the new national defense strategy and, you know, where our new priorities lie? Seems to be they lie elsewhere now, not in the Middle East. And just to add to that, since we're talking about great power competition, how worried should we really be? Because there seems to be like almost paranoia about first China, second Russia, and try to relate them not just to the Middle East, but just, you know, overall globally.
Well, if you think back to really the last decade, there has been a trend, and it's now a bipartisan trend, to focus more of U.S. resources, diplomatic, development, military, on the challenges emanating from particularly the Asia Pacific, or now the Indo-Pacific,
Right.
and specifically China. Under the Obama administration, it was the pivot or the rebalance. Under the Trump administration, it's the Indo-Pacific strategy. There's a lot of continuity and similarities between the approach, and I think historians will look back and see a broader trend attributable to one particular president. And implicit in that, of course, is that the Middle East, quote unquote, matters less. Now, what does that mean? I mean, it doesn't mean the Middle East doesn't matter. And I think the national defense strategy that this administration put out, certainly the Obama administration's approach to the Middle East, was very focused on the importance of the region to U.S. core national security interests, whether that involves fighting terrorism, the free flow of energy supplies, the security of Israel, and important non-proliferation goals. Those are core U.S. interests, and they endure today. That said, I think the logic certainly of the previous administration, the Obama administration, which I think in many ways still holds today, which is that in the decade after 9/11, the U.S. had become imbalanced in the way that it was approaching global challenges. And of course, you think back to 10 years ago, 150,000 troops in Iraq, you know, a broad campaign to fight terrorism that was draining American resources, American political will, American bandwidth, diplomatic bandwidth. And that was not perhaps the best use of our resources to prepare for the fights of the 21st century or the challenges of the 21st century. So I think, you know, one of the problems that I have with the debate, and certainly I experienced this in the Obama administration, I think it still holds today, which is that sometimes we talk about these issues as though there's sort of a black or white solution. It's an on-off. You either care about the Middle East or you don't. I talk about a little bit about this in the book because all three of the presidents that I focused on all grappled with this challenge of how you calibrate the use of American power, and where the political debate often drives you towards absolutist answer. You're either all in or you're all out, when in fact there's a middle way. You're, you know, navigate something where you're actually able to affect an outcome, to try to use influence, but not so much that it envelops you in something that raises the price for what are larger interests, against larger interests. So I think that what I see this administration doing, and certainly this is what I think the Obama administration tried to do, is recalibrate American power in the Middle East, not to withdraw from the Middle East entirely at all, but to try to use American power in all of its aspects, not just military, although military remains very important, to try to influence outcomes in the Middle East, understanding that even though the U.S. has tremendous ability to influence certain outcomes, it can't dictate outcomes. And I think that's the trap that sometimes we've fallen into over the years. Presidents of both parties have done it. where we think that we perhaps have more control over events than we in fact do. Now, this larger issue of great power clearly, I think that's one of the few bipartisan consensus issues we can think about today when it comes to foreign policy. Right. The debate lies not so much as is China a challenge, and is Russia, a challenge, but what are we going to do about it, and are we handling it the right way? Yeah. And so I think that if I think of the last 10 years and project forward, I think that that will remain the same. I mean, I think it's not overblown to think about the challenges that they present to the United States. That doesn't mean I think we're inevitably going to go to war with either country, but I think that there has to be recognition, particularly given what we've watched in the last several years, and particularly just in the last several months as the pandemic has manifested in different ways in Europe and the Middle East and the US, and the economic impact of that is going to manifest in different ways. And in some cases, the response to the US withdrawal from certain international organizations or the way it's handled itself abroad has, I think, given China and Russia to a certain extent an opening, and they're taking advantage of it. We're seeing this a little bit in the Middle East. I'd be interested in getting in the conversation on this. I don't want to overstate it, but there's no doubt that Russia obviously, and that's been going on for several years, but even China is seeking to take advantage of a different dynamic in the Middle East, and that's something we're going to have to watch very closely in the years ahead.
Speaking of countries we might go to war with, Iran. Before I get to Iran, I've always been curious, Derek. Do you know who's the depends who you ask, I have different answers. Who is the original author of the pivot, to East Asia? Well,
it's success has many authors, I guess.
Right.
What I can say is that this was, Barack Obama campaigned on this in 2007, 2008. Hillary Clinton believed it. Key figures like Tom Donilon and Kurt Campbell advocated it. Jim Steinberg was certainly, I'm thinking I was part of that transition in those early Obama years in 2008, 2009, 2010. And there wasn't a big debate over this in terms of, right, does this matter or not? Are we doing the right thing? It was more of a question of how do we do it? And particularly when you're trying to execute this maneuver, this rebalance, yeah, while we are still engaged. And remember, the Obama administration for the first several years in office was engaged in a big way in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So how do you execute this rebalance, which is a long-term play? And that's part of the strategic challenge is, yeah, we are in a political environment and a policy environment here in Washington and throughout the world that often finds it hard to reward long-term strategic plays because the urgent always pushes out the important. And whether that's in our attention in the headlines or what everyone's talking about at think tanks or in the press or in parliaments or in the Congress. And so these kind of steady, patient accumulation of successes or accumulation of strategies or tactics that add up to a strategy, sometimes that's often hard to perceive or hard to really get credit for in the moment. And that's something presidents of both parties have struggled with. But I think that history will look back as in the Obama administration as beginning that pivot. And I think history will look back at this administration, particularly as manifested through the National Defense Strategy or even what Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense did just yesterday in India as an example of kind of continuing to turn the dial on this strategic shift.
Right. And you talk about that long view in another book of yours, which I very much enjoyed reading, Derek. So let's get to Iran. JCPOA, you obviously had a hand in the negotiations and the management of it during your time.
If I could, just to clarify, actually, I had nothing to do with the negotiations, right? Because I was working at the Pentagon, and the Pentagon's job was not to be involved in the negotiations.
Well, that's true, but some kind of oversight, at least, that related to defense issues, right?
But this is the important point. I did a lot on Iran at the Pentagon, but it was not about the negotiations. It was what we do if negotiations fail.
That's right.
President Obama had said all options are on the table. my job at the Pentagon was to work with our colleagues there to ensure that those options were in fact on the table, that they were resourced, that they were exercised, and that they could be executed should the go order come.
Right, right. No, that fair point. I did recognize that the State Department was leading with John Kerry. So we moved from JCPOA, right, nuclear deal, to today, maximum pressure. I mean, let me leverage your concept, middle way. Is there a middle way? Have things gotten worse? I mean, how do you, depending on what happens, you know, over the next few days, I mean, how do you avert war between two countries that simply do not want it?
Well, I mean, let's step back. The JCPOA and the negotiations with Iran, despite what has been often suggested in the broader debate about what the Obama administration's intent was about Iran, was not about some broad rapprochement with Iran across the board. It was about a specific issue, the status and the limiting the progress of Iran's nuclear weapons program. That was the issue. A lot of other issues of problems between the US and Iran, and as critics of the JCPOA point out, those were not addressed in this narrow deal. Now, one can have an honest debate about whether, if you could rewind the clock, if you added all the issues, all the problems we had with Iran with some sort of comprehensive agreement, which is odd because the critics suggest Obama wanted a comprehensive agreement. He didn't. And that they criticized the JCPOA for not being a comprehensive agreement. Nevertheless, you know, the JCPOA is in that debate, and actually I talk about this in my book coming up, because the Iran debate is a critical moment and this is the 2015 debate around the JCPOA, in both the debate about Obama's foreign policy as well as the politics of foreign policy. And it's in many ways a vestige of the politics of foreign policy that we saw in the lead up and the immediate aftermath of the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003. So JCPOA was a very Obamian approach, which is we're going to narrowly focus on what is deemed the most urgent threat of Iran, not to dismiss the other threats at all, but the most urgent one, which was the status of its nuclear. Was it a perfect deal? Absolutely not. Very few negotiations that I'm aware of are perfect deals. This administration, of course, came in, and what's interesting is despite a lot of bluster initially, for the first year and a half or so, I think this administration was approaching this issue in a similar way that perhaps you would say a Hillary Clinton administration would have approached it, which is you're building on the JCPOA. You don't pull out immediately, but you work with the other partners who are part of the deal, particularly the Europeans, and you work to strengthen some of the shortcomings of the JCPOA, whether that's the sunset provisions or certain timelines, but then also address with partners the other aspects of Iran's behavior that are concerning to the US and detrimental to America's interests and those of our friends and allies. Iran's support for terrorism, Iran's proliferation of conventional weapons, Iran's efforts to destabilize the region and friendly regimes to the US. The Trump administration, really up until the spring of 2018, was pursuing that strategy. And as I was talking to, now out of government, I'm talking to particularly European colleagues who are still in government and part of these negotiations, I was quite optimistic that there was a deal possible to build on the JCPOA and strengthen it in various ways, and also address the other aspects of Iran's behavior that the US finds so troubling. But I think, frankly, for mostly ideological and political reasons, the plug was pulled, despite what I think were efforts made in good faith by Secretary Tillerson and other folks around him early on in the Trump administration to try to build on the JCPOA and strengthen it. So we are where we are. We're in maximum pressure strategy. It's no question that the Iranian regime is under great stress economically, and the U.S. almost weekly seems to be piling on new sets of sanctions, individuals or entities within Iran. There's no question that's having a pinch in Iran, but there's not a lot of evidence that I'm aware of that suggests that it's actually working, meaning what is the definition of working? Working means Iran coming to the negotiating table willing to talk to the US or European partners about something even remotely close to the JCPOA. Iran's regional behavior has not moderated that I'm aware of much at all. If anything, it's gotten worse. Iran's breakout time in terms of acquiring a nuclear weapon has been reduced to 2 to 3 months or so. And the U.S. is more isolated in the world from our partners who actually were key to bringing Iran to the table and negotiating the JCPOA. So it's not clear to me we've actually achieved much for the maximum pressure campaign. Now, my sense is that the current administration's play is to basically get through next week. Is that Iran is holding out to see what happens in the election, and that after the election, Iran, presuming that the president's reelected, that Iran will come crawling to the table. I'm dubious that's going to happen. And if the president were not to be reelected, I think Biden. And I'm not. By the way, I'm not here speaking for Biden or the campaign or anything like that. But what Biden has said publicly is he said that if elected, he would return to the JCPOA if Iran returns to compliance of the JCPOA, and that would be a starting point for follow-on negotiations. In many ways, it would be somewhat akin to the strategy the Trump administration was pursuing in the first year and a half in office, in terms of bringing Iran back into compliance with JCPOA, and then working with allies and partners to try to address some of the shortcomings in the original agreement.
Derek, you yourself see merit in the long view, and I'm trying to play devil's advocate. What if the administration really is taking the long view on Iran here? And yeah, despite all the very accurate negative things that you described in terms of consequences, what if they're really looking at it more strategically, and at some point hope maybe that these economic sanctions would really take a toll at some point and then really moderate the behavior of the Iranians? Is that too far-fetched?
Well, I think it's hard to we have to disentangle this a little bit. I mean, there's no question that pressure works. I mean, the predicate for the negotiations that brought about the JCPOA was tremendous economic pressure on Iran. Up until today, it was the greatest pressure the regime had been under. Now it's under even greater pressure. And again, that's the same logic of this, is that put pressure on Iran, they'll come back to the table, right, and negotiate a deal that's better than the JCPOA. There's just not a lot of evidence to suggest that is going to happen. So it is, I see the logic to it. I personally don't hold out hope that it's going to happen. And moreover, because Iran's timeline to breakout has been reduced so much, the urgency has gone up. And so I don't know how much time we've got, given Iran, because the Iran nuclear clock, I mean, this is kind of the classic way the folks frame the debate, is there's two clocks ticking in Iran. There's the clock of regime change, liberal democracy or greater freedom taking root in Iran, which is something we all would want to see, right? I mean, the regime is a repressive, brutal regime that exports terror, that destabilizes the region, that does not wish the United States or its partners well. But at the same time, we've got a nuclear clock. And what the JCPOA was meant to do was put the brakes on the nuclear clock to, in part, give us some time and space to help work on the political situation inside Iran, but then also to buy time and space to address these other issues of Iran's behavior. And this is also sort of the logic of this broader strategy that you talked about or asked about at the very beginning. It's hard to see how the United States is going to be positioned to play a long game in Asia or deal with the rise of China or the many aspects of the concerns about Russia's behavior if we're at war with Iran. Yeah. So that's, I mean, there's a larger, I mean, the logic of the rebalance initially was one of the reasons why the U.S. found itself out of position in the late 2000, around 2010, after the first decade of the 21st century, was because we had spent 7 years in a war in Iraq that was a war that was a mistake in retrospect, and something that did not put the U.S. in a good position to address the challenges of the 21st century. And so, given what we're facing today and given what we'll be facing in the coming years, whether it's what's happening out in the world and the shifting geopolitics or what's happening here at home, war with Iran does not seem to be a recipe for success on either of those fronts.
You mentioned the country next door, Iraq. Just very briefly, what is there's not one, there's several, but what is our biggest challenge in Iraq right now?
Well, the biggest challenge is certainly the Iranian, it's linked to the Iranian role in Iraq, which has been, quite active in recent months.
You see that worse than ISIS? Because there's a debate. There's a debate out there, and
it's it's hard to say. They're both very concerning. For the moment, ISIS is in the box, it seems, and the U.S. is on. I feel like from where I sit on the outside, I think we're down to about 3,000 troops in Iraq now, or that's what I think Frank McKenzie might have mentioned that when he was on your program a few months ago. And I think that feels about right. I think Vice President Biden has said on the campaign trail, maybe we go down to 2,000 or something. But the idea that we would go to zero, I guess there's an open question of whether Trump wants to go to zero. I think he probably does. But he personally, I think his Pentagon doesn't want to go to zero in terms of troops in Iraq. But I think that's a presence that's worth keeping. Again, it might go down a little, but I think that makes good sense, both in terms of helping the Iraqis build their capacity and maintain their capacity, but also to address ISIL and to prevent its resurgence.
What do you think happens if we leave?
Look, having lived through the 2014 era, I think it would be very imprudent if we were just for, ideological reasons, just to pull up stakes and go to zero.
Are you sympathetic to the proposition from Secretary Pompeo that, we're going to leave if you're not going to be able to protect us?
Well, I think it's absolutely appropriate to make it clear to a host country, wherever we are, that there are obligations as a host country to try to ensure the safety and security of our personnel there.
Right.
There is a question of our embassy, and frankly, I think there's been a lot of confusing messaging on this, right? In terms of the public sphere, I don't quite understand fully what's going on. There's saying we're going to pull the embassy out, we're not. I think taking a close look at the U.S. footprint in Baghdad, which those of you who've been there or who are there watching know how big it is. Taking a close look at that, I think. But pulling out wholesale from Iraq is, again, that it defies sort of the logic of the overall strategy. It's hard to see how you're going to push back against Iran, deal with ISIL, and help try to bring greater stability to the Iraqi government and give some opportunity to its people if you're not there.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Just in a few words, tell me, how should we handle another challenge, and that's a big country and a longstanding partner of ours, Saudi Arabia. I know there might be different approaches depending on who wins in the next few days, but just generally speaking, I'm still of the opinion that, frankly, whoever wins is still going to be, quite a important relationship, B, important challenge. So, which is your own observation, your own view on how we should maintain some kind of a balance. Well,
look, Saudi Arabia is a critical partner of the United States, and it has been for decades, going back to FDR. Obviously, the kind of geopolitical context of that partnership is changing, right? The U.S. is less reliant on oil, and that's a trend that's going to continue. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter at all, of course, because the free flow of energy resources is going to be a priority for the Middle East, for the Persian Gulf, and for in our relationship with Saudi Arabia for quite some time. That said, the context has changed. Look, the U.S. has ongoing particularly military intelligence relationship in Saudi Arabia. I got to play a role in this firsthand when I was in government. It's a very, very important relationship. Saudi Arabia obviously plays a key leadership role in the region among the Gulf states. But even that political context is changing. And I think all of us are watching. I'd be curious to know what many of our viewers think about the potential of Saudi Arabia following Bahrain or UAE in strength or opening ties somehow to Israel. But the relationship is particularly challenged right now. The behavior and the decisions of the current leadership in Saudi Arabia have been very problematic in the views of many American officials, lawmakers, analysts like myself, whether it's performance in the war in Yemen, whether it's involvement in brutal, unacceptable acts like the killing of a journalist in Turkey. And so those are, there's going to have to be some kind of reckoning about these things. That said, we can't lose sight of our larger interests. I think that a more constructive approach for the United States is something that's going to be far more balanced in the way it approaches Saudi Arabia. I think, I don't think it's being too political to say it's been basically a blank check for the last few years, and that's not a constructive relationship in my view. But it's a very, very important relationship that we have and that we need to maintain. We just need to, I think, in order for it to be, we're positioned to have this relationship reach its potential over the long term, it has to be recalibrated, because I do fear that the current course we're on, a breakup is more likely than not if we were just to stay on this course over time, because I think the politics here in the United States about the relationship are changing fundamentally.
Are you saying you don't have a silver bullet? I'm very disappointed there.
No, I do not. But believe me, I have learned the hard way not to think that there are any silver bullet or easy solutions to some of these challenges, particularly in the Middle East.
Yeah. Let's talk about the counter VEO campaign, violent extremist organizations. So AQI, transition to ISIS, counter ISIS campaign. I'm sure you had a lot to oversee there. Did you get to work with Ash Carter too?
When he was the deputy secretary, but I had left when he became. I left basically around the same time Hagel left as secretary of defense.
So, as you know, in many ways, to a large extent, it's been a military success thus far. Shrinking the territorial control, obviously killing a lot of fighters, I guess reducing the financial flows of the organization and all that. But it seems like you're reading pieces these days in New York Times and elsewhere that the organization once again is resurging. And of course, you want to better define what resurgence means, because it could mean different things to different people. But just your own view on where we are now in this generational fight, and maybe just identify for us just two key lessons from your time in government, but just as a scholar, general observer, from this whole fight against this very robust, resilient phenomenon.
Well, I mean, look, I approach this issue with a lot of humility because, certainly the Obama administration prioritized this mission, to try to first kind of reframe a U.S. approach to the Muslim world, but then also to address specifically the issues that underlie those that become tempted by pursuing violent extremist routes. I think where we are today, and again, this is not with the benefit of being able to see under the hood of what's actually happening, but it seems to me that resources that we have been expending on this are lower today. The rhetoric coming out of the United States today doesn't seem to be the kind that would be very helpful in trying to send a message to folks throughout the Muslim world that the U.S. cares about their future. When the first order of business of the current administration is to ban folks from certain countries coming into the United States, the so-called Muslim ban, that sends kind of the opposite message of what you're trying to do. And moreover, the decimation of particularly our diplomatic corps and the State Department, where many of these programs have been housed, isn't helpful either. So there's not. I think I agree with your take in that militarily, I think you can look back and say the strategy put in place by Ash Carter and others towards the end of the Obama administration, that was largely continued under this administration with some very important tweaks to it, including the support for the Kurds in Syria starting in 2017, has brought success on the battlefield, and that's a good thing. But I think this larger challenge, which is countering violent extremism, which is a more societal challenge. It's one that isn't amenable to a military solution alone. The military has a role, but it's not the sole solution. I feel like we're far behind on that, and I fear, and I mean I try to maintain optimism. That's the other thing I've learned in certainly in writing this current book about Ike and Bush 41 and Obama, is they were all optimists despite a lot of bad news that they had to face. But nevertheless, I do feel like we've lost a lot of ground on this counter-violent, the CVE strategy and approach over the last several years, and it's going to take a while to dig out of that.
Derek, I'm going to take a few questions from
Sure.
the audience here because they're proliferating.
Good.
And I won't be able to take all of them, so I'll just pick a few. Dina Mufti is asking you, what's your observation about aid money going to Israel? I think this is more like a question of return on investment. And then just add to that, what do you feel? I think it's an old topic, but still worth asking. What's the role of lobbying outfits such as AIPAC in this whole equation?
Well, I think the U.S. support for Israel is critical. And I was part of, again, in the Obama administration, the effort to work with Israel on all matter of military and intelligence issues, including providing them with significant capabilities to ensure that they maintain their qualitative military edge in the region. Of course, the Obama administration signed with Israel an MOU that was a record-breaking MOU for security support for Israel, and I think that's very important. And I think there has been a return on investment. I mean, the military and intelligence relationship with Israel is incredibly strong. It was strong in the Obama administration. I believe it's probably even stronger today under this administration. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing for U.S. interests. That's a good thing for both in the region and more globally. Israel is a very, very close partner of ours. And I don't think that's something that is just, the benefit, or it's something that's caused by particular interest groups. Obviously there are all sorts of folks in the debate for, on one side of the assistance issue and the other that have influence and have voice and who's have views that I respect. I can say, just having spent a little bit of time in the engine room of decisions on these issues, they're made on their merits. They're not made because of, just pure politics. And I would argue, from where I've sat, the return on investment, the partnership and the cooperation that we're able to enjoy has served U.S. interests.
Kane Carlisle is asking you a question about China and Russia. I guess these two countries just not too long ago signed an MOU or entered into some kind of a strategic partnership that has multiple elements, economic, security, and what have you. So I guess the question is, how worried should we be about that partnership?
Yeah, it's really good question. Thanks for it, and it's something that particularly when I get together with the Russia crowd, the Russia watchers, it's always a question for debate of what is the potential for that relationship, because there's no question that the two sides have done some things in recent years to try to show that they're working more closely together. My sense is that it's understandable why they're doing this. I think Russia probably wants it far more than China does. Russia is a country that has tremendous challenges. It's got a very capable military and is investing more and more into that military and its capabilities. But is increasingly more just a regional power. China's ambitions are different. China's reach is different. So I can understand why they do it. I personally don't worry too much about that blossoming into some formidable axis. I think there are big differences between the countries, between the two of them. But it's something clearly we have to watch closely. And I know that Russia watchers watch it closely and China watchers watch it closely. But I do think that there are real limits to how alignment can go.
You don't think these two would sign an actual defense treaty, do you?
I mean,
did the Chinese actually have any formal allies?
No,
right?
No. I mean, and this is actually a larger point, Bilal, which is really, I think, important when you just think about America's role in the world.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm so alarmed by where things have been recently in terms of the strain of many of our core alliances. Not all of our partnerships. Some of them you could argue are stronger today. But when I look at NATO, when I look at Asia, what makes the U.S. unique is this network of partnerships and allies, treaty allies that we have entered into formal agreements to and obliged to work together and defend one another. China doesn't have anything like that. Russia doesn't have anything. I mean, Russia doesn't. They may have countries that are beholden to them for economic reasons, because they're for security reasons, but they don't have allies.
Yeah,
and that's a unique asset of the United States, and it's not something that is necessarily permanent. It can be frittered away, and I worry that it is being frittered away.
Yeah, which is why Vice President Biden has really emphasized the issue of leadership and revitalizing partnerships and alliances. I mean, I do give credit to Secretary Esper just recently coming up with, I guess, a new acronym in the building called GDAP. So, once again, to strengthen alliances and partnerships. There seems to be disconnect with some rhetoric coming out of the White House. Anyway, there's a question from Joseph Yackley. He's not going to be happy with me because he's got 3 or 4 of them, so I'll just pick one. This is an old issue that we've seen play out across the globe. Whenever we do withdraw or retreat, someone else is going to fill in that vacuum, right? So, and typically it's been great powers, whether it's China or Russia. But his question is more about regional actors and how they have been able to fill in some of the vacuums created by us in the Middle East. How worried, I guess, should we be about that? Whether it's Turkey, whether it's Iran, or other rising regional powers, heck, even our own partners.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, if I could step back, and we have to think of what, and I just would ask viewers to think about this. This is how I think of it: is what is the steady state of America's presence, right? I mean, in other words, what do you think the ideal state should be? Because that's what, going back to my earlier point about it's often framed as withdrawal or intervention, or presence or no presence, when in fact today the U.S. has 50, if we just measure it by military terms alone, 50,000 or so troops in the Middle East. Tremendous capability there, far more capability in the region still today than we had pre 9/11. Yep. And I think that's going to stay there for a while, despite maybe some tweaks here and there, but that presence is going to remain. So we're not talking about full withdrawal. I mean, if the argument is that the U.S. should keep 150,000 troops in Iraq, well, let's have that debate about whether that's a good use of American resources. And so and this is where I think the challenge of the president comes in, is you have finite resources and 3 strategic arenas in the United States where we have two of the 3, we have treaty allies, Europe and Asia. The Middle East, we don't have treaty allies, but we have as close as you can get to treaty allies in countries, for example, like Israel.
Right.
And all 3 of those strategic arenas want more of the United States, right? When you go to Europe, they want more U.S. presence. I mean, that's why we have Europeans very concerned about announcements of U.S. withdrawal of 9,000 troops from Germany, right? When you go to Asia, lots of is the U.S. going to pull out some of its 28,000 troops from South Korea, right? When you look at the Middle East, okay, we got 50,000 troops that are stationed throughout the region. Concerns, are we going to draw down more? Well, the U.S. can't do everything, right? And more of everything is not a strategy. And part of how we kind of got into this problem is that we had a lot of more of everything thinking.
Peanut butter spread.
Pardon?
Peanut butter spread.
A bit, or frankly, not willing to look trade-offs straight in the face, right? And look, folks, we're going to have to be making some trade-offs in the future here. Like, we're heading into a major economic headwinds, the likes we probably haven't seen since the 1930s. And the idea that we can just, and we got a deficit that hasn't gotten a lot of attention here in the United States recently, but I think particularly if Biden wins and the Republicans are, all they've got is the deficit, we'll have a lot more of our deficit hawk talk happening here in the United States. That you haven't heard much about that recently, though.
Yeah.
So to me, it's how do you calibrate the U.S. presence, and you have to be mindful, as the questioner noted, about how others are going to react to that, right? But I also think that meaning that you have to be thoughtful about, if you do withdraw or you draw down a certain amount, how do others fill the gap? But that's why we have to make judgments that, do we care if others fill the gap? I mean, it may be that we understand that, yeah, like if we don't maintain 100,000 troops in Iraq, or 50,000 troops in Iraq, or 20,000 troops in Iraq, that may, weaken our ability to dictate outcomes there, but it may have to be made in the service of a larger strategic objective.
Yeah.
And that's a choice, right? That's a choice that actually this administration's making. It's a choice that the next administration's going to make. The other thing I'd like to say about this debate, whenever I hear about retrenchment and restraint and all that, almost exclusively seen through the military lens. And look, I used to work at the Pentagon. I get it, but U.S. power is far more, needs to be seen, and I think is far more diverse from that, right? And so, even when you the critique of the Obama administration about the U.S. withdrew from the Middle East. I mean, I would argue, looking at what the U.S. was actually doing in the Middle East, it was more involved in more ways on more issues than it had been previously. Yes, the military presence had been reduced, but it was still significant. And the U.S. was doing far more diplomatically, development on issues, fighting, countering violent extremism, trying to deal with some of the underlying societal challenges these countries faces than we were before. And so we also have to have a more kind of diverse definition of American power, rather than just reducing this to this single metric of military posture, bases, number of troops, weapon systems deployed.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned we don't have allies in the Middle East, so let me just correct you, and you know this better than anybody. Obviously, we do have the Turks as part of NATO. I don't know for how much longer.
Yeah, I think maybe this is my transatlantic bias. I think of them more as NATO.
No, I hear
you. Right, yeah.
But the only reason why I mentioned Turkey is not to give you a hard time. It's because Saleh Aka is asking you, actually, are we losing Turkey? I mean, that's the bottom line of the question.
It's a great question. Look, I'm an optimist, so I'm not going to say we're losing Turkey, but I think that the challenges in the U.S.-Turkey relationship have only gotten more concerning to me. I mean, I think just in the last week or so, they've tested the S-400, the Russian-made air defense system. We have, which is a huge problem for the U.S. and Turkey and NATO and Turkey. Turkey's behavior and its efforts in Karabakh, or whether it's in Libya, have been concerning. So, look, I think, and the political relationship between the two sides is something that has only gotten scratchier, and it hasn't been great for the last several years. Certainly, I lived through a lot of really serious disagreements with our Turkish friends about the U.S. role in Syria and what the administration would or would not do, the Obama administration in Syria, and that's obviously continued on today. And of course, the U.S. reliance on the Kurds, the SDF in Syria, is something that has been a major irritant in U.S.-Turkey relations. So look, this is going to be a big challenge, not just for the U.S. It's obviously a challenge for the NATO alliance as well, as Turkey is a NATO ally of ours.
I know it's never happened throughout history, but what would it take to actually for someone in NATO to lose their membership?
Well, it's a good question because my recollection is there aren't formal provisions in the alliance charter to remove to put someone on probation.
You can't vote someone out or something?
I don't think so. Yeah, I might be wrong about that, but I don't think so. I think there's provisions for a country to withdraw from the alliance, but not to be, kicked out, so to speak.
By all means, I'm not suggesting that we should. But
I think that's why I think
I'm
Turkey's a vital. I mean, it's an ally. It's a treaty ally. It's a vital. It is located in a critical part of the world. It's a critical part of the NATO alliance, and so we need to seek to try to right the ship there. Obviously, what's going on domestically in Turkey as well is very concerning to myself, and that's something we've got to work on as well.
Derek, how much longer do you have? Can you go for another couple of minutes after 11, or do you have to run?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I could go another 5 mintes, and then I.
Got it.
Sorry, I'm talking too long, so I'm.
No, you're good. I've got one from me, and then I'll take one that, matter of fact, is my favorite from the list of questions, the questions that I have on the list. So the one for me is almost half jokingly, 1 to 10, 10 being the worst. How badly did we botch Syria?
You mean in up to now, or just?
I mean, throughout.
Oh, I'd say 1 to, so 10's the worst.
Yep.
I'd say 7.
I thought it would be higher.
Happy to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jeff, give me your thoughts just very quickly.
So,
where did we royally screw up? What was the point where we're like, okay, we got this wrong?
Well, look, I'm humbled by the limits of U.S. power. I mean, this is there are certainly things we, but the idea that there were options available to the United States that were less than a significant U.S. military role in the Syrian civil war, I didn't see many of those options available. We can debate whether they were or not. Whether it would have mattered that if we had decided to begin to provide military assistance to the Syrian opposition in the fall of 2012 rather than the spring of 2013. Whether the U.S. should have done, post 2014 and the removal of the vast majority of the CW there, whether we would have been able to create a little more leverage in terms of over the regime if we had been willing to use American air power more surgically, particularly after we started the anti-ISIL air campaign in the fall of 2014. But I don't delude myself to think that any of that is the answer to solving the underlying issue of the Syrian civil war. And I think that given the constraints on American power, and the ability of what we can do, and given the other priorities we had in the world, the policy was essentially never stated this way, never publicized this way. And I would actually argue the policy still today is this, which is contain and mitigate. You want to try to contain the problem, mitigate its worst effects, whether those effects were refugees or the humanitarian crisis inside Syria, the destabilization of Syria's neighbors, and contain it from getting worse. Now, that was not all success. And I think, I share with what I think President Obama himself has said. I mean, I certainly feel this way, which is, you wrestle with the consequences of Syria every day. Yep. But kind of looking back and saying, well, geez, if we had just done this, all this would have been avoided. I'm not there. So, and I have a different view on the red line, obviously, than I think than a lot of people. I'm glad 1,300 tons of chemical weapons got out of Syria. We went to war in Iraq to deal with the WMD.
Not all of it, though.
Not all of it, but 1,300 tons. I mean, so, 1,300 tons of chemical weapons that would not have gotten out of there had we used force. Military strikes would not have gotten rid of 1,300 tons of chemical weapons. We went to war in Iraq to deal with a WMD threat that did not exist. And we are still dealing with those consequences today. We did not use force in Syria and ended up dealing with a WMD threat that did exist and was actually 10 times worse than the threat of Iraq was estimated to be. And we're still dealing with those consequences today. So, you know, this is you know, I very much share my former colleague and good friend Phil Gordon's view on this. He's got a great new book out I'd recommend everybody watching called Losing the Long Game. And it's about the kind of magical thinking behind many regime change efforts in the Middle East over the years, going back to Eisenhower all the way up to Syria. But, you know, Phil has a great kind of aphorism here, which is in Iraq, we went to war and we occupied, and we saw how that turned out. In Libya, we went to war and we did not occupy, and we saw how that turned out. And in Syria, we did not go to war and we did not occupy, and we saw how that turned out. And so it's kind of, now you can take from that just, you know, the conclusion may be throw up your hands, to hell with it. There's nothing we can do. You try, you don't, it's all a mess. I think my view, and Phil's view too, is that no, there are things we can do to try to affect an outcome, but we have to be very humble about our ability to just go in and fix everything. That's not realistic.
Let me ask you the final question, Derek, and I could have asked this right from the beginning because it's an important one. So this is from Sarah Collins. I'm just going to read it so I don't screw it up.
Sure.
This month marks the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security. And she's asking, in your experience, how much has the agenda of the WPS informed or influenced U.S. policymaking decisions on national security? And she's particularly interested in the application, or lack of the WPS framework to resolve conflicts in the Middle East.
That's a great question. I'm glad you raised it. I just want to note that we got the 20th anniversary of that. We have the 10th anniversary coming up of the Arab Spring, and I'm sure MEI and others are going to be doing already doing lots of programming.
Right.
Those important dates. It's a great question. Glad you asked it. I can say from my experience serving, particularly the first few years of the Obama administration in the State Department, when I served on the policy planning staff with Secretary Clinton, was Secretary of State, those issues, particularly the importance of addressing issues specific to the challenges and opportunities facing women and girls, was foremost on the agenda for Secretary Clinton. I think Secretary Kerry continued on much of that. I have to confess, I've not been tracking extremely closely what's been happening in this administration, but my guess is, and it's a fairly confident guess, is that those issues have been de-emphasized in this current administration. I think it's not just a shame, that's detrimental to U.S. long-term interests. I mean, there's a strategic argument there, and Secretary Clinton would often articulate it. About the importance of addressing issues specifically focused on women and girls to overall security. It's not just a do-gooder thing. It's something that actually matters for overall security, whether you're fighting violent extremism and the efforts there, or whether you're trying to give more opportunity and opening in societies to lift people up, to help them reach their full potential, to whether it's just bringing about greater stability. Addressing those issues, particularly focused on women and girls, is extremely important. So this is another area where I very much hope that with a different set of leaders, we might see at least a return to where I think things were headed a few years ago, and perhaps building on that and doing even better than we did back in the Obama administration. And so I'm glad you raised the anniversary. It's an important hallmark, and one hopefully we can do some things differently to realize the potential and the hopes that were behind that effort 20 years ago.
Well, all credit goes to Sarah for asking that question. And I'll be the first to admit, I can do a better job bringing on more female candidates to the show. Just recently we hosted Heidi Grant from the SCA.
Oh, great.
She was just terrific, and gave us a lot of food for thought on what the SCA is doing now in terms of security cooperation in the Middle East. But we could do more of that for sure. Derek, I'm going to do two things. One, thank you very much for being with us, but also remind people to, I'm going to sound like a late night host here, buy your book called The Middle Way, How Three Presidents Shaped America's Role in the World, and should be out in January 2021. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, my friend?
No, I just want to thank you for having me. Thanks for everyone tuning in. I enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to staying engaged with folks down the road. Thanks a lot.
We'll have the video uploaded any minute now,
Okay.
and I'll be happy to share it with you as well, Derek.
Terrific. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Enjoy Halloween.
Stay safe.